Thanks again, Francio, for that wonderful address. Our second speaker this morning is an old friend whom I'm happy to welcome here to the University of Chicago, Jonathan Scott Holloway, who is professor of history and African American studies and American studies at Yale University. There's also a Yale PhD, 1995. He's the author of Confronting the Veil, Abram Harris Jr., E. Franklin Frazier, and Ralph Bunche, 1919 to 1941. And I should say all of his work has made him perhaps one of the, perhaps the premier scholar of African American leadership and intellectual life from the mid-20th century forward, a period that is a period really that has only, I think, recently come into its own as a focal point for the understanding of the long history of African American intellectual history and intellectual life. He's also, in this vein, the editor of Ralph Bunche's A Brief and Tentative Analysis of Negro Leadership, which was published in 2005, and co-editor of the anthology Black Scholars on the Line, Race, Social Science, and American Thought in the 20th Century. He's presently working on his next monograph, Jim Crow Wisdom, Memory, Identity, and Politics in Black America, 1941 to 2000. And I must also add here, in what I think is just a delicious irony, that he's the 11th master at Yale of Calhoun College, named for that Calhoun, and the delicious, as I say, irony of history. So please join me in welcoming Jonathan Holloway.
Good morning. The title of this talk is Chicago is the Known City. I'll begin with two quotes here. Chicago is the city from which the most incisive and radical Negro thought has come. There's an open and raw beauty about that city that seems either to kill or endow one with the spirit of life. I felt those extremes of possibility, death, and hope while I lived half hungry and afraid in a city to which I had fled with the dumb yearnings to write, to tell my story. But I did not know what my story was, and it was not until I stumbled upon science that I discovered some of the meanings of the environment that battered and taunted me. I encountered the work of men who were studying the Negro community, amassing facts about urban Negro life, and I found that sincere art and honest science were not far apart, that each could enrich the other. The huge mountains of fact piled up by the Department of Sociology at the University of Chicago gave me my first concrete vision of the forces that molded the urban Negro's body and soul. Chicago is the known city. Perhaps more is known about it, how it is run, how it kills, how it loves, steals, helps, gives, cheats, and crushes than any other city in the world. It's Richard Wright from his introduction to Black Metropolis. Richard Wright, I think we can all agree, had a special way with words. Whether you liked his style or not, and he certainly had his detractors, Wright's words had a way of penetrating beneath your skin, leaving a bruise that lingers too long, creating a scratch you can't quite itch. When Professor Cohen, Kathy Cohen, Deputy Provost Cohen, all your many hats, sent me the original email inviting me to speak today about the exhibition in the library's main gallery, I understood that my task would be to discuss the evolving relationship between African American scholars and the University of Chicago. Given my past work on the history of intellectuals, many of whom studied here and some of whom eventually worked here, eventually being underlined, I presumed that I would train my attention solely on the development of, say, the famed Chicago School of Sociology or Robert Park's connection to generations of black scholars. But then I started rereading Richard Wright, and his words came barreling toward me, challenging me, daring me to flinch lest they pierce my skin and settle in. I know that at one point I tried to get out of the way, tempted myself, I think as we always are, by the allure of falling back on selections from earlier work. But I moved too late. His words got to me, and I have been unable to free myself. I'm currently working, as Professor Warren mentioned, on a book titled Jim Crow Wisdom, Memory, Identity, and Politics in Black America, 1941 to 2000. In that book, I wrestle with the memory performances of the black middle and upper classes during a period of radical change in this cohort's life chances. In the second chapter of the book, I set out to examine how the social science literature of the 1940s created a taxonomy of black life that privileged the institutions and mores of the middle and professional classes. The lower classes, except in specific ways that I will get into later, were left out of the conversation. The more I read of the social science literature, the more often this construction appeared. It was too deliberate an act to be coincidence, and it then occurred to me that for a variety of reasons, the social scientists were editing out certain aspects of the black experience. You might be wondering how all of this relates to a book on memory. Put simply, in this chapter, I read the scholars' editing as a powerful form of forgetting. But then there was Richard Wright. His work was an outlier in the strongest sense of the term. I had to make sense of him, and the more I tried, the larger role he began to play in this chapter. What I'd like to do today is share just a small part of that chapter to give you a sense of how I'm working through Richard Wright's presence in my scholarly life. And he really has become something of a specter. And more important to the purpose of the symposium, illuminate the deep and abiding connections between African American intellectuals, the city of Chicago, and the University of Chicago in the 1930s and 40s. Bring. Using the shrill ringing of an alarm clock as the opening sonic image of his explosive 1940 novel Native Son, Richard Wright brought to the reading public a new kind of language to use and approach to take when talking about race, violence, poverty, and social injustice. Native Son simultaneously captivated and terrified its readers with the story of central character Bigger Thomas's abject poverty and his subsequent slide into an impossible nightmare when he accidentally kills a wealthy white teenage girl. With this book, Wright tore into the consciousness of the reading public. Native Son won all manner of accolades and sold nearly 250,000 copies soon after being named to the Book of the Month Club. What was it that drew readers to Wright's Nightmare? It's unlikely they came for the mere spectacle, since they could get something akin to that merely by opening their newspaper to the crime blotter, where colored meant criminal. No, instead they came to Native Son because they believed that it offered them a purchase on the Negro worldview. Native Son then allowed white liberal friends of the race to see behind the veil and moan and stammer and shout. This is all by design, of course, and Wright said as much in his evocative essay, How Bigger Was Born. He had no intention, Wright said, of repeating in Native Son what he called the naive mistake he had made in Uncle Tom's Children, published 2 years earlier. Upon reading glowing reviews of this earlier work, Wright realized and then lamented, quote, that I had written a book which even bankers' daughters could read and weep over and feel good about. I swore to myself that if I ever wrote another book, no one would weep over it, that it would be so hard and deep that they would have to face it without the consolation of tears. Clearly, Wright met his determination with great success, as white readers experienced something akin to national shock therapy when they read Native Son. But Wright also wrote against what he felt to be the black bourgeois desire to forget. As he makes clear in How Bigger Was Born, Wright maintained great disaffection for the black middle class's penchant to edit out certain stories of the larger black experience. And I quote, I know from long and painful experience that the Negro middle and professional classes were the people of my own race who were more than others ashamed of Bigger and what he meant. Having narrowly escaped the Bigger Thomas reaction pattern themselves, indeed still retaining traces of it within the confines of their own timid personalities, they would not relish being publicly reminded of the lowly, shameful depths of life above which they enjoyed their bourgeois lives. Never did they want people, especially white people, to think that their lives are so much touched by anything so dark and brutal as Bigger. Their attitude toward life and art can be summed up in a single paragraph. But Mr. Wright, there are so many of us who are not like Bigger. Why don't you portray in your fiction the best traits of our race, something that will show the white people what we have done in spite of oppression? Don't represent anger and bitterness. Smile when a white person comes to you. Never let him feel that you are so small that what he has done to crush you has made you hate him. Oh, above all, save your pride. As the above quotes illustrate, Wright made a conscious decision to craft his stories in such a way that the middle classes would squirm. While privileged white readers might shift about due to discomfort, they might also be restive because of their desire to gaze more intently into or on the black experience. On the other hand, privileged blacks would merely be struggling to prevent the lifting of this veil. Wright's thoughts here remind us that he was engaged in a creative act, one that allowed him the freedom to invoke a response in his audience. But in a chapter that is actually devoted to the work of social scientists, we need to come to terms with Wright's occupancy of the intersection between creativity and empiricism. How does Wright, for example, figure into a conversation about a body of knowledge driven by empirical interventions? Again, this faith that the truth shall set us free. This is a question we cannot evade, since even though critics disdained Wright's style for the way that it stripped away the veneer that other respectable blacks had worked to create, I skipped a line, I'm sorry. This is a question we cannot evade, since even though critics disdained Wright's style for the way that it stripped away the veneer that other respectable blacks had worked to create, many considered his work to be well-grounded in socially scientific methods. In fact, Wright himself felt he was motivated by what he read in social science literature. One can bear witness to this throughout How Bigger Was Born. The reference to personality types, classifications of the various Bigger Thomases, the participant observation in Dixie and Chicago, and his own moments of ethnographic field reporting when he gets his first job in the Black Belt. More literally, one sees this clearly in Wright's 12 Million Black Voices, a project pushed through quickly on the heels of Native Son's success. The book, produced with Edwin Roscom, was envisioned as an extended photo essay about black folklife. The plan was for Wright's commentary to accompany archival photographs of the New Deal's Farm Security Administration. But while his editors wanted a quick turnaround on the project, Wright dove into research mode. Wright had lived much of the southern rural struggles that the FSA photographers depicted, and he could draw as well on some of his own experiences migrating to Chicago when he wrote about the images that portrayed the crushing poverty of tenement life in the North. But Wright pushed further than the personal and made extended research trips to various locations along the paths of the Great Migration. The social scientific angle was particularly pronounced when Wright moved to Chicago, the known city, to conduct research. Here, Wright relied upon the files of UC alum Horace Caton, director of the Good Shepherd Community Center of Chicago, and soon to be co-author with UC alum St. Clair Drake of the milestone Black Metropolis, a study of Negro life in a northern city. In his 1945 introduction to Black Metropolis, Wright made plain his debt. He acknowledged, quote, the huge mountains of fact piled up by the Department of Sociology at the University of Chicago, because they gave him his first concrete vision of the forces that molded the urban Negro's body and soul. He continued saying that, quote, it was from the scientific findings of men like the late Robert E. Park, Robert Redfield, and Lewis Worth that I drew the meanings of my documentary book, 12 Million Black Voices. In a similar way, a few years earlier, in the closing paragraphs of his own foreword to 12 Million Black Voices, Wright pointed to the scholarship of social scientists D. Franklin Frazier, Arthur Raper, Ira D.A. Reid, Lewis Worth, George Mitchell, and Caton, once again, many of whom were, in one way or another, University of Chicago men, all of whom were certainly connected intellectually to the social science engine of this great school. Wright made a special effort to lavish praise upon Caton and his generous spirit even before Black Metropolis appeared. The admiration was clearly mutual, and in it we hear a, quote, real social scientist, Caton, blessing Wright's creative works. For example, in Caton's November 15, 1941 Pittsburgh Courier column that regularly focused on economic and labor issues, he presented a review of 12 Million Black Voices. He began his comments, however, talking about Native Son. With my associates in sociology and social anthropology, I studied the social, economic, and psychological background which produced Bigger Thomas of Native Son. For every adjective which Wright used, we have a label. For every move that Bigger took, we have a map. For every personality type he encountered, we have a life history. What I'm trying to get across is the fact that in general, a large research project which was carried on in Chicago's Black Belt for a period of 4 years substantiated the entire thesis of Native Son. We produced the material, we know the theory, but we could not state it in the power of form it needed. This new book, 12 Million Black Voices, is magnificent in its simplicity, directness, and force. But 12 Million Black Voices is more than just description. It is a philosophy of the history of the Negro in America and a frame of reference for the study of Negro-white relations in this country. It seems hard for me to see just how any intelligent social observer can disagree with Wright. Caton was certainly correct about Wright's ability to craft bold and lingering images. For all of its deep connection to the social sciences, 12 Million Black Voices speaks with a lyricism that is anything but socially scientific. Whether sociological or lyrical, one thing that captures my attention is the fact that Wright opens the book with an observation and claim that speak directly to the phenomenon of introduction and of elision that are part of the art of forgetting. Each day, Wright says, when you see us black folk upon the dusty land of the farms or upon the hard pavement of the city streets, you usually take us for granted and think you know us. But our history is far stranger than you suspect, and we are not what we seem. Wright's invocation of the first person plural is instructive here because through it he suggests to the reader at least two things: that his personal experiences inform his interpretations of the black condition, and that this condition could even be captured in the unmodified we. In the world of social science, with this gesture, he assumes the authorial privilege of the participant observer and the ethnographer. Even though inserting the nuance would destroy the phrasing, there is no beauty, after all, in saying something like, most of us are not what most of you think most of us seem to be. Wright relies on the first person plural throughout the book to offer his readers an easier access to the foundational forces in black life. The hushed intimacy of the we pulls the reader close, so Wright can impart the secret that there might be more to black life than whites were prepared to imagine. Later, in a chapter titled Inheritors of Slavery, the 82-page heart of the book, Wright continues with this tone of intimacy, but merges it effectively with the language of the social scientist, who returns to the theme of that which is not known and points to the fact that the black subject is also an agent, and like an author, is editing all the while. I quote here, "The steady impact of the plantation system upon our lives created new types of behavior and new patterns of psychological reaction, welding us together into a separate unity with common characteristics of our own. We strove each day to maintain that kind of external behavior that would best allay the fear and hate of the lords of the land. And over a period of years, this dual conduct became second nature to us, and we found in it a degree of immunity from daily oppression. Even when a white man asked us an innocent question, some unconscious part of us would listen closely, not only to the obvious words, but also to the intonations of voice that indicated what kind of answer he wanted. And automatically we would determine whether an affirmative or negative reply was expected, and we would answer, not in terms of objective truth, but in terms of what the white man wished to hear. If a white man stopped a black on a southern road and asked, 'Say there, boy, it's 1 o'clock, isn't it?' the black man would answer, 'Yes, sir.' If the white man asked, 'Say, it's not 1 o'clock, is it, boy?' the black man would answer, 'No, sir.'" Wright's intonation here provides a springboard for us to move from his incarnation as a social science-influenced creative essayist to official social science of the era. Although you will not find authors' notes in these texts about trying to craft an anthropology or sociology that would prey on the minds of white America, you certainly find instances of powerful editing. Some of this editing lined up very neatly with the kind of lower-class black dissemblance Wright presented in 12 Million Black Voices. But most of the editing was of a type that Wright found deeply unsettling, an editing that was the province of black middle-class desire to evade larger black social realities. There was little debating that as a work of fiction, Native Son refined social realism as a style and established the intellectual and creative foundation for future generations of African American authors who wanted to speak with a brutalizing honesty to their readers. But in many circles in the 1940s, Native Son and Wright's other creative works, for that matter, was not allowed merely to be fiction. Wright's work in this era straddled the creative and empirical worlds and ultimately took on a veneer of both. To that end, much of his work could be interpreted as a sort of group memoir for the way that it gave whites a glimpse into at least some aspect of black life in America. At the same time, given its strong sociological sensibilities, its wrestling with issues of poverty, urban decay, class radicalism, and human possibility, many readers viewed Wright's work as nothing less than modern social science clothed in a compelling narrative. Horace Caton's editorial confirms as much. There was a logic to both ways of regarding Wright's landmark achievements, since they appeared at a moment when a new wave of scholarship on the state of black America began to be published. Social scientists like economists Abram Harris and Sterling Spiro, political scientists Ralph Bunche and Emmett Dorsey, anthropologist Allison Davis, and sociologists Charles S. Johnson and E. Franklin Frazier, the last three all UC affiliates, were churning out scholarship about the black worker, race, and economics, the changing social structures of rural life, and the effects of rapid urbanization on black families. These writers were part of a generation of scholars that produced work that simultaneously introduced unknown aspects of black life to a larger reading public and applied the lived experiences of their black subjects to new methodologies of modern social science. Given their professional successes and rising public profiles, one can conclude that readers were ready to see the Negro in a new light, wanting to better understand how to make sense of the challenges raised by blacks' increasingly public claims on full citizenship rights in the American scene. In the trade press world, a democratizing voice was ascendant in fields like sociology, where one could see a trend toward a scholarship that could be deciphered and then consumed by a larger reading public. E. Franklin Frazier, for example, published his first major work, The Negro Family in Chicago, in 1932, a revision, as it happens, of his University of Chicago dissertation. This book broke new ground in talking about the effect rural to urban black migration had on the black family structure. 7 years later, and in response to a strong demand for an expanded picture of his sociological examination of the black family in Chicago, Frazier published The Negro Family in the United States. This latter book won plaudits as one of the best books on contemporary race relations and elevated Frazier to the top of his field. Within the world of sociology, only Charles S. Johnson, then the head of the Department of Social Science at Fisk University, and like Frazier, protege of University of Chicago sociologist Robert Park, could be seen as his peer. In addition to chairing the Department of Social Science, Johnson established the Fisk Institute of Race Relations, and through this institute, he and his research team churned out data-rich analyses of black life in the Middle South. These were a technician's dream. But in line with the democratizing move seen in so many of the social sciences, Johnson also worked toward the mainstream. His 1941 book, Growing Up in the Black Belt, Negro Youth in the Rural South, clearly reflects this trend. Written as part of a series prepared for the American Youth Commission, a series in which Frazier's Negro Youth at the Crossways also appeared, Growing Up in the Black Belt offered its readers very little in terms of raw numbers and statistics, but devoted most of its energy to vignettes of Southern black youth, their social and cultural place in their local settings, and their attitudes about such phenomena as race, marriage, and relations with whites. In the preface to Johnson's book, Robert Sutherland, the Associate Director for Studies of Negro Youth, a unit of the American Youth Commission, perhaps inadvertently captured the era's sensibility when he hailed the book primarily as, quote, a human interest document. Sutherland continued in a similar vein. Seldom has a scientific report, he wrote, brought its readers so close to the intimate lives of the people who are studied. Seldom have life history materials retained their naturalness and human flow as they do in the personal quotations which are presented in every chapter. Although he made sure to acknowledge that Growing Up in the Black Belt would be valuable to social scientists for its extensive use of carefully planned statistical and case study methods, Sutherland seemed most enthused by the fact that the general public would benefit because, quote, the reader can draw from the real-life situations of Negro youth reported in their own words. Although it's important not to make too much of this preface, Sutherland's words beg further contemplation. At the heart of the matter is the obvious. An introduction is intended to, in this case, distill key ideas and illuminate the most salient points of what is to come. Sutherland does just this. He points the reader to the most valuable aspect of Growing Up in the Black Belt, its open discussion of wide variations of personality types among Black American youth, and he applauds the book for remaining accessible to the broader possible audience. But seeing beyond, or perhaps through, Sutherland's appraisal, one can sense in him an enthusiasm for the book that bordered on spectacle. Here is a book, Sutherland seems to declare, that will finally tell us what we need to know about Black youth. Sutherland's preface, then, can be read as a preface to an introduction to the race. While not using these precise words, Johnson comes very close to saying as much in his own opening to Growing Up in the Black Belt. He concludes the opening pages stating that the scheme of this volume is to present by way of introduction to the study of the personality development of Southern rural Negro youth, brief though fairly complete pictures of 10 youth in their intimate setting. Taking Johnson's word, we need to think about what an introduction to the race might entail, because in his and other scholars' hands, such an introduction could take on whatever construction they desired to make. The potential for great irony cannot be missed. The very social scientist who inspired Richard Wright's creative work had the ability and wherewithal to introduce the race according to the terms of the middle-class sensibilities Wright abhorred. But what of Johnson's book-length introduction to the race? What does Johnson talk about? The book focuses upon youth, of course, but in the process of describing these individuals, who places them into their respective social and cultural frames? One chapter, for example, is dedicated to, quote, status and security, and provides an analysis of who occupies which social classes in Black America and the tensions that grow out of striving to retain or attain certain class standing. Johnson devotes much of his attention to the Black middle and upper classes, their constant struggles to hang on to their respective social standing, and their almost obsessive need to perform the Victorian rituals of proper behavior and decorum. Even though he admits that the great majority of Southern rural Blacks resided in the lower classes, he cites 82% at one point, Johnson's attention is firmly set upon the other 18% of the population and the stresses and social pressures related to class mobility. But what of lower class youth? Where do they fit into this discussion of status and security? Johnson affords the lower class youth a scant 3 pages in his 29-page chapter and explains that while most Blacks are part of this lower class, their family situations are largely hopeless. Even though he acknowledges that many Blacks are trapped in the lower classes due to social and economic forces beyond their control, there is an overrepresentation of social misfits residing at the bottom, trapped in a cycle that defies escape. As Johnson put it, the hopelessness of their status contributes to a type of free living that acknowledges little responsibility to accepted standards. Education is used by the lower classes less as a means of escape than as a means of handling some urgent practical problems like counting and reading notices. With less opportunity for recognition through education, money, or status, the youth of these families may seek their self-assurance in free sexual activity, in a reputation for physical prowess, or for being a bad man, and in other forms of antisocial behavior. The bad men who can cut and kill and get away with it, the ones without conscience concerning various types of sexual behavior, the hopeless ones seeking to escape their troubles and status through chronic drunkenness, are likely to be found more frequently in this category than in the others. There is an earlier sole paragraph in the same chapter that talks about the underworld in Black America, and that describes this world as occupied by people who, quote, fall outside the recognized and socially sanctioned class categories, persons who are free from the demands of society, the wide people, the vagabonds, the worthless and undeserving poor, who are satisfied with their status, the outcasts and bad niggers, prostitutes, gamblers, outlaws, renegades, and free people. But beyond this paragraph and the 3 pages mentioned above, there's nothing else in this chapter, and extremely little worth noting in the rest of the book, that points to aspects of Black life and behavior that falls outside the social norms of greater middle-class society. This is the important point to understand about this introduction to the race. Only part of the race is introduced. There was no doubt that Johnson had to make choices all along the way in assembling this book about what kind of story to tell, what evidence merited the most attention, and so forth. When we consider this, we need to pay attention to Johnson's class status and how it must have infiltrated his objective gaze when writing the manuscript. Authors' choices, governed by conscious and unconscious forces, always play a role in what they choose to share with the reader, of course. But here, the willful exclusion of what the author declares to be the majority of the race in a book that is intended to introduce the race begs the question again: who exactly is being introduced? There is a follow-up to this question, and the answer to it may be even more important. Why are certain people, perhaps even very large portions of the population, not being introduced? Richard Wright would have none of this, of course. He made a determined point of introducing the 82% of the race that Johnson ignored, and he always did so in the most provocative and excruciating ways. Wright's was a creative act that was informed by the social science of the era and his own lived experience in Chicago. But just as Chicago and the social science practice there helped Wright discover a voice and a passion that held disdain for middle-class efforts to edit the black experience, it might be worth wondering to what extent Chicago, the known city that kills, loves, steals, helps, gives, cheats, and crushes, may have overwhelmed Wright's ability to see the humanity that managed to survive in this crucible. Can't begin to resolve that speculation today, but it is clear that there are many stories to be told of how Chicago and its university served as an incubator for ideas about race that far outstrip the physical limits of the city or the school. I remain curious about where our understanding of Black America might be without the surveys, census trackings, psychological studies, and ethnographies that define the era. I will never be as certain in anything in my life as Richard Wright was in his, but at least I know that we as scholars are better off for his contributions and the way that they were inspired by and messily clashed with the ideals of all those ghosts who are around us today. Ghosts who, because of all their hard work and brilliance, really need no introduction. Thank you.
All right. You both invoked the city of Chicago in your talks, and I'm wondering if you might say a bit more about the relationship between the university and the city. What role does the city and migration and the changing nature of the city have on both the policies of who's allowed here, the nature of the scholarly enterprise, and changes and so forth? So.
Well, I think that the city is really important. I make a larger argument in my book that for Black social scientists to be trained at any groups, you need this combination between city and faculty and this Black social reform movement, and certainly that's happening in Chicago from the turn of the century. And so there's this attraction, but I think I would just emphasize that it's the city, and I think Jonathan did this brilliantly. The city is important. The city of Chicago is important both as a place to be for these black students who have largely come from the South or been trained at Black institutions. So the city is freeing, even when for some people in the city they're feeling more segregated. For the people that come, it's much more open, and then it provides a field of research. And as Jonathan suggests, this is not uncomplicated. And it's sort of the ways that people interact. And I think that there's ways in which, say, Columbia, because of the relationship between the charity organization society and some of the Columbia professors, there's a way that Columbia becomes a place where scholars can also do this. So, and they have New York, so it's not just Chicago. Some of you know that William I. Thomas gets in trouble separate from his relationship with Black students. So some of the kind of intellectual principles that are happening stop, and then the students that come later may be more attracted to I actually don't think they're more attracted to Park, and I think that the relationship between their work and Park's work on marginality is overstated, because if you look at a lot of them, they don't seem to believe that in marginality. I mean, I'll let Jonathan talk about Fraser, but I think that is a relationship that's overstated, but also the relationship between Park and other black intellectuals. It goes both ways. Park goes to teaching FISC. He's involved in a lot of other things, so. But I think the city itself is something, and being able to, in some ways, even change class or have other things happening is very important.
To emphasize 2 points, and I love the way you say it is not an uncomplicated relationship. Chicago was the laboratory, and that is not uncomplicated at all. But because of the demographics of the city, the residential housing patterns, the shifting residential housing patterns, the violence, the cultural assault, all these things, the life of the city, it is a perfectly sort of finite space, even if it's a massive one, to conduct huge sociological, anthropological studies. It just fits well with this agenda. I'm a little rough on the years, but Thomas Zaniecki, this is like 1912, looking at the Polish peasant. Once the demographic changes in Chicago, there's a way of sort of an inward-looking opportunity that just becomes present. So I think something is symbiotic as well. The other thing, so Chicago as a lab is just it's a perfect laboratory. The other thing to think about with Francile's point about how overdetermined Park may be in this whole process. One thing that is, in speaking about Fraser, when Fraser came from the Atlanta School of Social Work, he was running for his life. There's this. He, in talk about Chicago being a freer place, he had published the pathology of race prejudice. When he talked to the psychopathology of white men desiring black women, and this is what this is all about. That didn't go over too well in Atlanta, and he literally, fled for his life. And so Park, I don't see it so much as running to Park and the University of Chicago, but running to opportunities created by Park. He was a gatekeeper, and that, it's not so much for me the intellectual model, because Fraser takes his contact and accommodation thesis and adds a whole other step to it that Park never could quite get to, dealing with the way that race just defines and orders so much of the black life. Park never had to run from a lynch mob or the threat of one. But Park was the vehicle for all these other people to meet each other or to head out. And that's where I think his role is really quite vital. Anyway.
I had a question about Wright's relationship with the sociologists and how you make use of the question, and also, and I think there's never an end to questions about Wright and his relationships to his environment in a way. And I always think of, or you're talking, you think of the episode in Black Boy in the American Hunger part, which is another kind of editing or editing because it comes out so much later. Wright lampooning the laboratory with that episode of him working in the biological sciences lab, where he and the other guy working with him, tear apart the lab accidentally. And I just wonder if he, how authentic was he being about, how did he really feel about science, the science part of social science, and Chicago as a laboratory? I think it was very complicated.
Wright has to be one of the most complicated people, I've ever come up against. In fact, just yesterday, in a grad course I'm teaching on black intellectuals, the week before we read Black Metropolis and 12 Million Black Voices. That's where my inspiration came from. And I also had them read How Bigger Was Born, just to let's just get this whole thing started. And then this week they read the collection Wright's Black Power. It's been packaged in these 3 books. And they're like, this is Richard Wright? I mean, this person who's looking way down his nose at Africans and Ghanaians, and they couldn't reconcile. This is Wright. I mean, he's a completely complicated person, granted. Now, I do think, to add more texture, something I didn't talk about here, I grant, but adds texture to try to understand Wright's his narration of himself is, and speaking of American Hunger as a perfect example, is, he's writing, when I was quoting here, the earlier parts of the quotes, I mean, in the middle of his Communist Party days, that really also, I think, colors his disdain for, the middle class and the bourgeois. I mean, he's not completely doctrinaire at this point, but it's there. So that adds a whole nother layer to ask questions about Wright's sincerity. And, you can even ask questions about the sincerity of a preface. What is the work, what work is going on in a preface in general? What else is Wright going to say, before a book like Black Metropolis? But I do think that because of the social nexus of Chicago, that there is something more. It's not just pose. Like when I talk about Wright's admiration for Black Metropolis, I think that there's something richer there, just in terms of the daily intellectual commerce between someone like Wright and Horace Caton, and they're sharing files and information. So the question is a really good one. I can't ever exactly know the answer, but my faith is that I think he's, for the most part, he can be read as being quite sincere at that moment.
This may be a little bit related to the question I just asked. I think that I'm very curious about how you as a historian look at literary form in this case. So I can see that a lot of social scientific documents, all the things that you related, maybe one document, and also Richard Wright, as a writer, can have both non-fictional writings and fictional writings like novel. And I can see that the social scientific reports, documents can go into a lot of the fillers of this form, novel form, and characterization, dialogues, narrative voice, or say perspectives. I think most of the fillers can be embedded into the social scientific records, but plot or something that will make this literary form as a novel work, maybe something that may not be quite closely traceable through this indebtedness to the social scientific discourses. And I'm just wondering, where do you find some kind of a tension between Richard Wright as a fiction writer and social scientifically minded intellectual, and you yourself as a social scientifically minded historian and in relation to this literary form? And there may be some tension between what you said about the tension between creativity and social science. And I want to hear where you find the interesting tension.
My head's about to explode. I'll try to, if I don't catch everything, just remind me. With Richard Wright, I think, I know that in How Bigger Was Born, he's musing openly in this 20-page essay or so about process for him. And, he talks about, it's really fascinating, he talks about how, he wanted to tell a story, couldn't figure out what it was, and he came to Chicago, and it was only when he's walking literally in the streets of Chicago, almost as an ethnographer, it begins to hit him about what he's going to do or how he's going to do it, which I thought was an interesting choice. You can see the construction of a social science mentality. But he points out, as far as other kinds of inspirations, in the introduction, in How Bigger Was Born, he talks about all he had to do is look at the newspaper. If Bigger is drawn as a caricature of some purely animalistic reaction, human being could only react and not act. He said something like 3/4 of the way through writing his first draft, there was I'm forgetting the name, but a story that is eerily similar to the one he has already written, being played out in the newspaper in Chicago. Again, I can't remember the name of the person he cites in passing. So, thinking about Wright as a novelist, I think of him as a social realist novelist, which is really critical in thinking about plot, because I think it allows him to draw from the newspaper, the social scientist, allows him to draw from the facts of life instead of being worried about as much the art of the plot in a more humanistic sort of way. I don't know if that holds. I mean, I'm ignoring Ken fidgeting over here. Now, it's about my own. I can't quite remember the question about how I approach it. But I will say this, thinking of a historian, I was trained as a historian, but I've never actually taught just in the history department. I've always had joint appointments and have been around people working in interdisciplinary fields. And so as I move towards this new work, I'm feeling much more, I'm just sort of embracing, why can't I be interdisciplinary? Goodness, and for goodness sakes. And so pulling on a whole different range of sources than I ever have before. So I think I'm just trying to stretch and start thinking about the the art of how something is put together, whether it is literally visual depictions, art. This book, if I can pull it off, will be talking about dance, for example, in one chapter, through the built environment in architecture, and through Richard Wright in social science. I'll be sort of trying a little bit of different things. So I don't really quite know the answer yet, except for I'm trying to learn it.
As I said, I was noting that two of the figures mentioned at the end of How Bigger Was Born are Nathaniel Hawthorne and Henry James, and Wright goes as far as to say that were those two writers writing today,
That's right,
that the topic they would find most fruitful for their exploration of American life would be a figure like Bigger, or the plight of the American Negro. And those two writers are explicitly not realist in their aesthetic orientation. One can make an argument about James in some respects, but these are writers associated, Hawthorne with romance, and James specifically with the rise of sort of the American aesthetic novel, or American modernism. And so that for Wright, I think that there is an argument that Native Son, despite its obvious debt to the realist tradition of the American novel and its explicit invocation of someone like Theodore Dreiser, is an attempt to bring to bear the sensibilities of something like literary modernism and high aestheticism through the the devastating portrayal of the social realities of someone like Bigger's life to the African American novel, so that there is a kind of deep commitment to high literary art and form, somehow being worked out also through a novel that's very much, and I think unabashedly in some ways, sociological in the ways that that Wright describes it. So,
thank you.
Wright also had, and Wright is a social scientist, Wright also had access to a set of sources that probably nobody else has ever seen, that we can't have access to, which is Wright saw the urban leagues. Chicago Urban League did industrial surveys, hundreds of interviews with migrants, and Wright saw those. And they're gone. Although we know that Wright saw them in the inventories of the WPA. So he had, as a social scientist, he had access to such sources. Nobody, as far as I know, nobody else uses.
First off, I want to thank both of you for wonderful presentations. I hate waking up early in the morning, but if I knew it would be this good every morning, I'd be up. It's a pleasure to I have a question for Professor Wilson in particular. I'm interested in what you see as the relationship between the South, and I guess the HBCU in the South, in relation to Chicago and the early scholars. So in many ways, I think Chicago as a university is kind of worse as far as, what we might think of as a migration trope, right? And that, scholars or people come from the South to Chicago as a place where there's, greater level of freedom of movement and opportunity. But I think at the same time, the limits show themselves at some point. I think for a lot of these scholars, it came at the point of, well, you've been here, you trained, you now have a PhD, and your options in terms of the academy require you to return to the South and the HBCU in the South in hopes of employment, at least, in the academy. So you see people like Monroe Berg and George Edmund Haynes returning to, Fisk and Tuskegee, and then certainly in the later period with, Fraser and Johnson, and them living out, their careers at these HBCUs in the South. So I'm just wondering what you see sort of as that tension with respect to the migration story and what it means for like a career path.
Well, thanks for the question. I think that I started kind of where you are, like, okay, you come, it's great, and then you have to leave. But as I did the work, at least the first two generations, their impulses and why they go back is more complicated. And I think it's important to realize that the first generation, Haynes, Richard Robert Wright, the other Richard Wright, who I've been calling R. Wright. I mean, he called himself that, but it's less it doesn't get confusing. While R. Wright said, I'm not going back, and he actually turned down an opportunity to teach at Howard and stayed in the AME Church, which because I think he and Work reportedly were, at the very least, very boring preachers, and probably, sort of were too academic in the pulpit. There was a place in the AME Church for intellectuals. And so he could become an editor of the Christian Recorder. There was a place for him. And some people have argued that the Christian Recorder functioned the same way the Chicago Defender in Philadelphia, the same way the Chicago Defender did, as an argument for migrants. But my larger point is the first cadre actually starts writing about migration before the Great Migration. And they start writing about migration at the in 1900. And so George Edmund Haynes' dissertation is The Negro at Work in New York City, and it's basically research he does in 1908 and 1910. So when the Great Migration starts, they're in place. Now George Edmund Haynes wants to go to Fisk. It's his alma mater. He starts the sociology department at Fisk. But he also co-founds the Urban League. So for a while he has two jobs simultaneously. And so what I do find is that the first and second generations of black social scientists, they want to be social scientists to some extent. Some of them want to do research in the South, but after 1905, this politically becomes impossible. Du Bois's study of Lowndes County is just in 1906, which both R. Wright Jr. and work on was probably his most advanced study. It gets destroyed. Nobody's ever seen even a scrap of it, and and he's pushed out. Du Bois himself is pushed out of the South. It becomes very difficult to do research in the South, and so there we have this problem that I don't know if Charles S. Johnson feels it, but certainly his critics feel that the Urban League's, their structure of research is all empiricism. and no analysis. And so this is where you can get where some people that are in the urban league structure, like Ira Reid, that want to get working class voices in, they actually have to use fiction. So Ira Reid has this frontispiece to a very boring Urban League report on blacks in the Union, where he has a quote, a long conversation that he actually puts together. It's not a conversation in the novel, from Claude McKay's Home to Harlem, as a way of getting black workers' voices in. Because if you look at all those Urban League reports, there are no voices. And I would agree, but I think that there is a tension there, class tensions. The first generation is fighting over, over slavery, in fact, and who are the rightful heirs of the enslaved tradition. And people haven't really looked at, I think, that is an argument. People are arguing about, can we talk about sexual abuse? I think Darlene Clark Hahn has talked about, how that gets dissembled in social science, but black club women are actually writing about it and talking about it. Can we talk about violence in the family? And I'm excited about Jonathan's new work because I think that it will look at both the forgetting, but I think like Woodson publishes the letters from the Chicago Defender of the Migrants as a way of getting these things on the historic, published as historical documents. But Woodson is a person who he had he had read newspapers to coal miners, because he worked as a coal miner before he went to high school, that were black Civil War veterans. And they would argue with the newspaper. So he was very sensitive to the idea that working class black people had their own thoughts and ideas in ways that some of the later social scientists absolutely were not. So I think that as Jonathan and other people's work come out, we'll see that there are actually a lot of tensions and people are straining at the confines of the disciplines and trying to find ways to, if you're going to be accepted as a major social scientist before, 1980? You have to show that you can do work like they do. And that's a problem if you want to get working class black voices in the conversation.
Just 1980?
Well, I was trying to get a later date.
Please join me in thanking Jonathan